The Wild Sands by Hans Christian Andersen. Far hence, in a country whither the swallows fly in our winter time, there dwelt a king who had 11 sons and one daughter, the beautiful Elise. The 11 brothers, they were princes, went to school with stars on their breasts and swords by their sides. They wrote on golden tablets with diamond pens and could read either with a book or without one. In short, it was easy to perceive that they were princes. Their sister Elise used to sit upon a little glass stool and had a picture book which had cost the half of a kingdom. Oh, the children were so happy, but happy they were not to remain always. Their father, the king, married a very wicked queen, who was not at all kind to the poor children. They found this out on the first day after the marriage, when there was a grand gala at the palace. For when the children played at receiving company, instead of having as many cakes and sweetmeats as they liked, the queen gave them only some sand in a little dish and told them to imagine that was something nice. The week after, she sent the little Elise to be brought up by some peasants in the country, and it was not long before she told the king so many falsehoods about the poor princes that he would have nothing more to do with them. "Away out into the world and take care of yourselves," said the wicked queen. "Fly away in the form of great speechless birds." But she could not make their transformation so, disagreeable as she wished. The princes were changed into 11 white swans. Sending forth a strange cry, they flew out of the palace windows, over the park, and over the wood. It was still early in the morning when they passed by the place where Elise lay sleeping in the peasant's cottage. They flew several times round the roof, stretched their long necks, and flapped their wings, but no one either heard or saw them. They were forced to fly away, up to the clouds and into the wide world. So on they went to the forest, which extended as far as the seashore. The poor little Elise stood in the peasant's cottage, amusing herself with a green leaf, for she had no other plaything. She pricked a hole in the leaf and peeped through it at the sun, and then she fancied she saw her brother's bright eyes, and whenever the warm sunbeams shone full upon her cheeks, she thought of her brother's kisses. One day passed exactly like the other. When the wind blew through the thick hedge of rose trees in front of the house, she would whisper to the roses, "Who is more beautiful than you?" But the roses would shake their heads and say, "Elise." And when the peasant's wife sat on Sundays at the door of her cottage reading her hymn book, the wind would rustle in the leaves and say to the book, "Who is more pious than thou?" "Elise," replied the hymn book. And what the roses in the hymn book said was no more than the truth. Elise was now 15 years old. She was sent for home. But when the queen saw how beautiful she was, she hated her the more, and would willingly have transformed her like her brothers into a wild swan. But she dared not do so, because the king wished to see his daughter. So the next morning, the queen went into a bath, which was made of marble, and fitted up with soft pillows and the gayest carpets. She took 3 toads, kissed them, and said to one, "Settle thou upon Elise's head, that she may become dull and sleepy like thee. Settle thou upon her forehead," said she to another, "and let her become ugly like thee, so that her father may not know her again. And do thou place thyself upon her bosom," whispered she to the third, "that her heart may become corrupt and evil, a torment to herself." She then put the toads into the clear water, which was immediately tinted with a green colour, and having called Elise, took off her clothes and made her get into the bath. One toad settled among her hair, another on her forehead, and the third upon her bosom. But Elise seemed not at all aware of it. She rose up, and 3 poppies were seen swimming on the water. Had not the animals been poisonous and kissed by a witch, they would have been changed into roses whilst they remained on Elise's head and heart. She was too good for magic to have any power over her. When the queen perceived this, she rubbed walnut juice all over the maiden's skin, so that it became quite swarthy, smeared a nasty salve over her lovely face, and entangled her long, thick hair. It was impossible to recognize the beautiful Elise after this. When her father saw her, he was shocked and said she could not be his daughter. No one would have anything to do with her but the mastiff and the swallows. But they, poor things, could not say anything in her favour. Poor Elise wept and thought of her 11 brothers, not one of whom she saw at the palace. In great distress, she stole away and wandered the whole day over fields and moors till she reached the forest. She knew not where to go, but she was so sad and longed so much to see her brothers, who had been driven out into the world, that she determined to seek and find them. She had not been long in the forest when night came on, and she lost her way amid the darkness. So she lay down on the soft moss, said her evening prayer, and leaned her head against the trunk of a tree. It was so still in the forest. The air was mild, and from the grass and mould around gleamed the green light of many hundred glowworms. And when Elise lightly touched one of the branches hanging over her, bright insects fell down upon her like falling stars. All the night long she dreamed of her brothers. They were all children again, played together, wrote with diamond pens upon golden tablets, and looked at the pictures in the beautiful book which had cost half of a kingdom. But they did not, as formerly, make straight strokes and pothooks upon the tablets. No, they wrote of the bold actions they had performed and the strange adventures they had encountered. And in the picture book, everything seemed alive. The birds sang. Men and women stepped from the book and talked to Elise and her brothers. However, when she turned over the leaves, they jumped back into their places so that the pictures did not get confused together. When Elise awoke, the sun was already high in the heavens. She could not see it certainly, for the tall trees of the forest entwined their thickly leaved branches closely together, which, as the sunbeams played upon them, looked like a golden veil waving to and fro. And the air was so fragrant, and the birds perched upon Elise's shoulders. She heard the noise of water. There were several springs forming a pool, with the prettiest pebbles at the bottom. Bushes were growing thickly round, but the deer had trodden a broad path through them, and by this path Elise went down to the water's edge. The water was so clear that had not the boughs and bushes around been moved to and fro by the wind, you might have fancied they were painted upon the smooth surface, so distinctly was each little leaf mirrored upon it, whether glowing in the sunlight or lying in the shade. As soon as Elise saw her face reflected in the water, she was quite startled, so brown and ugly did it look. However, when she wetted her little hand and rubbed her brow and eyes, the white skin again appeared. So Elise took off her clothes, stepped into the fresh water, and in the whole world there was not a king's daughter more beautiful than she then appeared. After she had again dressed herself and had braided her long hair, she went to the bubbling spring, drank out of the hollow of her hand, and then wandered farther into the forest. She knew not where she was going, but she thought of her brothers and of the good God who, she felt, would never forsake her. He it was who made the wild crab trees grow in order to feed the hungry, and who showed her a tree whose boughs bent under the weight of their fruit. She made her noonday meal under its shade, propped up the boughs, and then walked on amid the dark twilight of the forest. It was so still that she could hear her own footsteps and the rustling of each little withered leaf that was crushed beneath her feet. Not a bird was to be seen, not a single sunbeam penetrated through the thick foliage, and the tall stems of the trees stood so close together that when she looked straight before her, she seemed enclosed by trellis work upon trellis work. Oh, there was a solitariness in this forest such as Elise had never known before. And the night was so dark, not a single glowworm sent forth its light. Sad and melancholy, she lay down to sleep, and then it seemed to her as though the boughs above her opened, and that she saw the angel of God looking down upon her with gentle aspect, and 1,000 little cherubs all around him. When she awoke in the morning, she could not tell whether this was a dream or whether she had really been so watched. She walked on a little farther and met an old woman with a basket full of berries. The old woman gave her some of them, and Elise asked if she had not seen 11 princes ride through the wood. "No," said the old woman, "but I saw yesterday 11 swans with golden crowns on their heads swim down the brook near this place." And she led Elise on a little farther to a precipice, the base of which was washed by a brook. The trees on each side stretched their long, leafy branches towards each other, and where they could not unite, the roots had disengaged themselves from the earth and hung their interlaced fibres over the water. Elise bade the old woman farewell and wandered by the side of the stream till she came to the place where it reached the open sea. The beautiful sea lay extended before the maiden's eyes, but not a ship, not a boat was to be seen. How was she to go on? She observed the numberless little stones on the shore, all of which the waves had washed into a round form. Glass, iron, stone, everything that lay scattered there had been moulded into shape, and yet the water which had effected this was much softer than Elise's delicate little hand. "It rolls on unweariedly," said she, "and subdues what is so hard. I will be no less unwearied. Thank you for the lesson you have given me, ye bright rolling waves. Some day, my heart tells me, you shall carry me to my dear brothers." There lay upon the wet seagrass 11 white swan feathers. Elise collected them together. Drops of water hung about them, whether dew or tears she could not tell. She was quite alone on the seashore, but she did not care for that. The sea presented an eternal variety to her. More indeed in a few hours than the gentle inland waters would have offered in a whole year. When a black cloud passed over the sky, it seemed as if the sea would say, "I too can look dark." And then the wind would blow and the waves fling out their white foam. But when the clouds shone with a bright red tint, and the winds were asleep, the sea also became like a rose leaf in hue. It was now green, now white, but as it reposed peacefully, a slight breeze on the shore caused the water to heave gently, like the bosom of a sleeping child. At sunset, Elise saw 11 wild swans with golden crowns on their heads fly towards the land. They flew one behind another, looking like a streaming white ribbon. Elise climbed the precipice and concealed herself behind a bush. The swans settled close to her and flapped their long white wings. As the sun sank beneath the water, the swans also vanished, and in their place stood 11 handsome princes, the brothers of Elise. She uttered a loud cry, for although they were very much altered, Elise knew that they were, felt that they must be, her brothers. She ran into their arms, called them by their names, and how happy were they to see and recognize their sister, who was now grown so tall and so beautiful. They laughed and wept, and soon told each other how wickedly their stepmother had acted towards them. "We," said the eldest of the brothers, "fly or swim as long as the sun is above the horizon, but when it sinks below, we appear again in our human form. We are therefore obliged to look out for a safe resting place, for if at sunset we were flying among the clouds, we should fall down as soon as we resumed our own form. We do not dwell here. A land quite as beautiful as this lies on the opposite side of the sea, but it is far off. To reach it, we have to cross the deep waters, and there is no island midway on which we may rest at night. One little solitary rock rises from the waves, and upon it we only just find room enough to stand side by side. There we spend the night in our human form, and when the sea is rough, we are sprinkled by its foam. But we are thankful for this resting place, for without it we should never be able to visit our dear native country. Only once in the year is this visit to the home of our fathers permitted. We require 2 of the longest days for our flight, and can remain here only 11 days, during which time we fly over the large forest, whence we can see the palace in which we were born, where our father dwells, and the tower of the church in which our mother was buried. Here even the trees and bushes seem of kin to us. Here the wild horses still race over the plains, as in the days of our childhood. Here the charcoal burner still sings the same old tunes to which we used to dance in our youth. Here we are still attracted, and here we have found thee, thou dear little sister. We have yet 2 days longer to stay here, then we must fly over the sea to a land beautiful indeed, but not our fatherland. How shall we take thee with us? We have neither ship nor boat. How shall I be able to release you? Said the sister, and so they went on talking almost the whole of the night. They slumbered only a few hours. Elise was awakened by the rustling of swans' wings which were fluttering above her. Her brothers were again transformed, and for some time flew around in large circles. At last they flew far, far away. One of them remained behind. It was the youngest. He laid his head in her lap and she stroked his white wings. They remained the whole day together. Towards evening the others came back, and when the sun was set, again they stood on the firm ground in their natural form. Tomorrow we shall fly away, and may not return for a year, but we cannot leave thee. Hast thou courage to accompany us? My arm is strong enough to bear thee through the forest. Shall we not have sufficient strength in our wings to transport thee over the sea? Yes, take me with you, said Elise. They spent the whole night in weaving a mat of the pliant willow bark and the tough rushes, and their mat was thick and strong. Elise lay down upon it, and when the sun had risen, and the brothers were again transformed into wild swans, they seized the mat with their beaks and flew up high among the clouds with their dear sister, who was still sleeping. The sunbeams shone full upon her face, so one of the swans flew over her head and shaded her with his broad wings. They were already far from land when Elise awoke. She thought she was still dreaming, so strange did it appear to her to be travelling through the air and over the sea. By her side lay a cluster of pretty berries and a handful of savoury roots. Her youngest brother had collected and laid them there, and she thanked him with a smile, for she knew him as the swan who flew over her head and shaded her with his wings. They flew so high that the first ship they saw beneath them seemed like a white seagull hovering over the water. Elise saw behind her a large cloud. It looked like a mountain, and on it she saw the gigantic shadows of herself and the 11 swans. It formed a picture more splendid than any she had ever yet seen. Soon, however, the sun rose higher, the cloud remained far behind, and then the floating shadowy picture disappeared. The whole day they continued flying with a whizzing noise, somewhat like an arrow, but yet they went slower than usual. They had their sister to carry. A heavy tempest was gathering, the evening approached. Anxiously did Elise watch the sun. It was setting. Still the solitary rock could not be seen. It appeared to her that the swans plied their wings with increasing vigour. Alas, it would be her fault. If her brothers did not arrive at the place in time, they would become human beings when the sun set, and if this happened before they reached the rock, they must fall into the sea and be drowned. She prayed to God most fervently. Still no rock was to be seen. The black clouds drew nearer. Violent gusts of wind announced the approach of a tempest. The clouds rested perpendicularly upon a fearfully large wave which rolled quickly forwards. One flash of lightning rapidly succeeded another. The sun was now on the rim of the sea. Elise's heart beat violently. The swans shot downwards so swiftly that she thought she must fall, but again they began to hover. The sun was half sunk beneath the water, and at that moment she saw the little rock below her. It looked like a seal's head when he raises it just above the water. And the sun was sinking fast. It seemed scarcely larger than a star. Her foot touched the hard ground, and it vanished altogether like the last spark on a burnt piece of paper. Arm in arm stood her brothers around her. There was only just room for her and them. The sea beat tempestuously against the rock, flinging over them a shower of foam. The sky seemed in a continual blaze, with the fast succeeding flashes of fire that lightened it, and peal after peal rolled on the thunder, but sister and brothers kept firm hold of each other's hands. They sang a psalm, and their psalm gave them comfort and courage. By daybreak, the air was pure and still, and as soon as the sun rose, the swans flew away with Elise from the rock. The waves rose higher and higher, and when they looked from the clouds down upon the blackish-green sea, covered as it was with white foam, they might have fancied that millions of swans were swimming on its surface. As day advanced, Elise saw floating in the air before her a land of mountains intermixed with glaciers, and in the centre, a palace a mile in length with splendid colonnades surrounded by palm trees and gorgeous-looking flowers as large as mill wheels. She asked if this were the country to which they were flying, but the swans shook their heads, for what she saw was the beautiful airy castle of the fairy Morgana, where no human being was admitted. And whilst Elise still bent her eyes upon it, mountains, trees, and castle all disappeared, and in their place stood 12 churches with high towers and pointed windows. She fancied she heard the organ play, but it was only the murmur of the sea. She was now close to these churches, but behold, they have changed into a large fleet sailing under them. She looked down and saw it was only a sea mist passing rapidly over the water. An eternal variety floated before her eyes, till at last the actual land to which she was going appeared in sight. Beautiful blue mountains, cedar woods, towns and castles rose to view. Long before sunset, Elise sat down among the mountains in front of a large cavern. Delicate young creepers grew around so thickly that it appeared covered with gay embroidered carpets. "Now we shall see what thou wilt dream of tonight," said her youngest brother, as he showed her the sleeping chamber destined for her. "Oh, that I could dream how you might be released from the spell," said she, and this thought completely occupied her. She prayed most earnestly for God's assistance. Nay, even in her dreams she continued praying, and it appeared to her that she was flying up high in the air towards the castle of the fairy Morgana. The fairy came forward to meet her, radiant and beautiful, and yet she fancied she resembled the old woman who had given her berries in the forest and told her of the swans with golden crowns. "Thou canst release thy brothers," said she, "but hast thou courage and patience sufficient? The water is indeed softer than thy delicate hands, and yet can mould the hard stones to its will, but then it cannot feel the pain which thy tender fingers will feel. It has no heart, and cannot suffer the anxiety and grief which thou must suffer. Dost thou see these stinging nettles, which I have in my hand? There are many of the same kind growing round the cave where thou art sleeping. Only those that grow there, or on the graves in the churchyard, are of use. Remember that. Thou must pluck them, although they will sting thy hand. Thou must trample on the nettles with thy feet, and get yarn from them. And with this yarn thou must weave 11 shirts with long sleeves, throw them over the 11 wild swans, and the spell is broken. But mark this, from the moment that thou beginnest thy work till it is completed, even should it occupy thee for years, thou must not speak a word. The first syllable that escapes thy lips will fall like a dagger into the hearts of thy brothers. On thy tongue depends their life. Mark well all this." And at the same moment the fairy touched Elise's hands with a nettle, which made them burn like fire, and Elise awoke. It was broad daylight, and close to her lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dream. She fell upon her knees, thanked God, and then went out of the cave in order to begin her work. She plucked with her own delicate hands the disagreeable, stinging nettles. They burned large blisters on her hands and arms, but she bore the pain willingly in the hope of releasing her dear brothers. She trampled on the nettles with her naked feet and spun the green yarn. At sunset came her brothers. Elise's silence quite frightened them. They thought it must be the effect of some fresh spell of their wicked stepmother, But when they saw her blistered hands, they found out what their sister was doing for their sakes. The youngest brother wept, and when his tears fell upon her hands, Elise felt no more pain. The blisters disappeared. The whole night she spent in her work, for she could not rest till she had released her brothers. All the following days she sat in her solitude, for the swans had flown away, but never had time passed so quickly. One shirt was ready. She now began the second. Suddenly a hunting horn resounded among the mountains. Elise was frightened. The noise came nearer. She heard the hounds barking. In great terror, she fled into the cave, bound up the nettles which she had gathered and combed into a bundle, and sat down upon it. In the same moment, a large dog sprang out from the bushes. 2 others immediately followed. They barked loudly, ran away, and then returned. It was not long before the hunters stood in front of the cave. The handsomest among them was the king of that country. He stepped up to Elise. Never had he seen a lovelier maiden. "How camest thou here, thou beautiful child?" said he. Elise shook her head. She dared not speak. A word might have cost her the life of her brothers, and she hid her hands under her apron, lest the king should see how she was suffering. "Come with me," said he. "Thou must not stay here. If thou art good as thou art beautiful, I will dress thee in velvet and silk. I will put a gold crown upon thy head, and thou shalt dwell in my palace." So he lifted her upon his horse, while she wept and wrung her hands. But the king said, "I only desire thy happiness. Thou shalt thank me for this some day." And away he rode over mountains and valleys, holding her on his horse in front, whilst the other hunters followed. When the sun set, the king's magnificent capital with its churches and cupolas lay before them, and the king led Elise into the palace, where, in a high marble hall, fountains were playing, and the walls and ceiling displayed the most beautiful paintings. But Elise cared not for all this splendor. She wept and mourned in silence, even whilst some female attendants dressed her in royal robes, wove costly pearls in her hair, and drew soft gloves over her blistered hands. And now she was full dressed, and as she stood in her splendid attire, her beauty was so dazzling that the courtiers all bowed low before her, and the king chose her for his bride, although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the beautiful lady of the wood must certainly be a witch who had blinded their eyes and infatuated the king's heart. But the king did not listen. He ordered that music should be played. A sumptuous banquet was served up, and the loveliest maidens danced round the bride. She was led through fragrant gardens into magnificent halls, but not a smile was seen to play upon her lips or beam from her eyes. The king then opened a small room next her sleeping apartment. It was adorned with costly green tapestry and exactly resembled the cave in which she had been found. Upon the ground lay the bundle of yarn which she had spun from the nettles, and by the wall hung the shirt she had completed. One of the hunters had brought all this, thinking there must be something wonderful in it. "Here thou mayest dream of thy former home," said the king. "Here is the work which employed thee. Amidst all thy present splendor, it may sometimes give thee pleasure to fancy thyself there again." When Elise saw what was so dear to her heart, she smiled, and the blood returned to her cheeks. She thought her brothers might still be released, and she kissed the king's hand. He pressed her to his heart and ordered the bells of all the churches in the city to be rung to announce the celebration of their wedding. The beautiful dumb maiden of the wood was to become queen of the land. The archbishop whispered evil words in the king's ear, but they made no impression upon him. The marriage was solemnized, and the archbishop himself was obliged to put the crown upon her head. In his rage, he pressed the narrow rim so firmly on her forehead that it hurt her, but a heavier weight, sorrow for her brothers, lay upon her heart. She did not feel bodily pain. She was still silent. A single word would have killed her brothers. Her eyes, however, beamed with a heartfelt love to the king, so good and handsome, who had done so much to make her happy. She became more warmly attached to him every day. Oh, how much she wished she might confide to him all her sorrows. But she was forced to remain silent. She could not speak until her work was completed. To this end, she stole away every night and went into the little room that was fitted up in imitation of the cave. There she worked at her shirts, but by the time she had begun the 7th, all her yarn was spent. She knew that the nettles she needed grew in the churchyard, but she must gather them herself. How was she to get them? Oh, what is the pain in my fingers, compared to the anguish my heart suffers, thought she. I must venture to the churchyard. The good God will not withdraw his protection from me. Fearful as though she were about to do something wrong, one moonlight night she crept down to the garden and through the long avenues got into the lonely road leading to the churchyard. She saw sitting on one of the broadest tombstones a number of ugly old witches. They took off their ragged clothes as if they were going to bathe, and digging with their long, lean fingers into the fresh grass, drew up the dead bodies and devoured the flesh. Elise was obliged to pass close by them, and the witches fixed their wicked eyes upon her. But she repeated her prayer, gathered the stinging nettles, and took them back with her into the palace. One person only had seen her. It was the Archbishop. He was awake when others slept. Now he was convinced that all was not right about the Queen. She must be a witch who had, through her enchantments, infatuated the king and all the people. In the confessional, he told the king what he had seen and what he feared, and when the slanderous words came from his lips, the sculptured images of the saints shook their heads as though they would say, "It is untrue. Elise is innocent." But the Archbishop explained the omen quite otherwise. He thought it was a testimony against her that the holy images shook their heads at hearing of her sin. 2 large tears rolled down the king's cheeks. He returned home in doubt. He pretended to sleep at night, though sleep never visited him. And he noticed that Elise rose from her bed every night, and every time he followed her secretly and saw her enter her little room. His countenance became darker every day. Elise perceived it, though she knew not the cause. She was much pained, and besides, what did she not suffer in her heart for her brothers? Her bitter tears ran down on the royal velvet and purple. They looked like bright diamonds, and all who saw the magnificence that surrounded her wished themselves in her place. She had now nearly finished her work. Only one shirt was wanting. Unfortunately, yarn was wanting also. She had not a single nettle left. Once more, only this one time, she must go to the churchyard and gather a few handfuls. She shuddered when she thought of the solitary walk and of the horrid witches, but her resolution was as firm as her trust in God. Elise went. The king and the Archbishop followed her. They saw her disappear at the churchyard door, and when they came nearer, they saw the witches sitting on the tombstones as Elise had seen them, and the king turned away, for he believed her whose head had rested on his bosom that very evening to be amongst them. "Let the people judge her," said he, and the people condemned her to be burnt. She was now dragged from the king's sumptuous apartments into a dark, damp prison where the wind whistled through the grated window. Instead of velvet and silk, they gave her the bundle of nettles she had gathered. On that must she lay her head. The shirts she had woven must serve her as mattress and counterpane. But they could not have given her anything she valued so much, and she continued her work, at the same time praying earnestly to her God. The boys sang scandalous songs about her in front of her prison. Not a soul comforted her with one word of love. Towards evening she heard the rustling of Swans' wings at the grating. It was the youngest of her brothers, who had at last found his sister, and she sobbed aloud for joy, although she knew that the coming night would probably be the last of her life. But then her work was almost finished, and her brother was near. The Archbishop came in order to spend the last hour with her. He had promised the king he would. But she shook her head and entreated him with her eyes and gestures to go. This night she must finish her work, or all she had suffered, her pain, her anxiety, her sleepless nights, would be in vain. The archbishop went away with many angry words, but the unfortunate Elise knew herself to be perfectly innocent and went on with her work. Little mice ran busily about and dragged the nettles to her feet, wishing to help her, and the thrush perched on the iron bars of the window and sang all night as merrily as he could that Elise might not lose courage. It was still twilight, just 1 hour before sunrise, when the 11 brothers stood before the palace gates, requesting an audience with the king. But it could not be, they were told. It was still night. The king was asleep, and they dared not wake him. They entreated, they threatened, the guard came up. The king himself at last stepped out to ask what was the matter. At that moment, the sun rose, the brothers could be seen no longer, and 11 white swans flew away over the palace. The people poured forth from the gates of the city. They wished to see the witch burnt. One wretched horse drew the cart in which Elise was placed. A coarse frock of sackcloth had been put on her. Her beautiful long hair hung loosely over her shoulders. Her cheeks were of a deadly paleness. Her lips moved gently, and her fingers wove the green yarn. Even on her way to her cruel death, she did not give up her work. The 10 shirts lay at her feet. She was now labouring to complete the 11th. The rabble insulted her. Look at the witch, how she mutters. She has not a hymn book in her hand, no. There she sits with her accursed hocus-pocus. Tear it from her. Tear it into 1,000 pieces. And they all crowded about her and were on the point of snatching away the shirts when 11 white swans came flying towards the cart. They settled all round her and flapped their wings. The crowd gave way in terror. It is a sign from heaven. She is certainly innocent, whispered some. They dared not say so aloud. The sheriff now seized her by the hand. In a moment she threw the 11 shirts over the swans, and 11 handsome princes appeared in their place. The youngest had, however, only one arm, and a wing instead of the other, for one sleeve was deficient in his shirt. It had not been quite finished. "Now I may speak," said she. "I am innocent." And the people who had seen what had happened bowed before her as before a saint. She, however, sank lifeless in her brother's arms. Suspense, fear, and grief had quite exhausted her. "Yes, she is innocent," said her eldest brother, and he now related their wonderful history. Whilst he spoke, a fragrance as delicious as though it proceeded from millions of roses diffused itself around, for every piece of wood in the funeral pile had taken root and sent forth branches. A hedge of blooming red roses surrounded Elise, and above all the others blossomed a flower of dazzling white colour, bright as a star. The king plucked it and laid it on Elise's bosom, whereupon she awoke from her trance with peace and joy in her heart. And all the church bells began to ring of their own accord, and birds flew to the spot in swarms, and there was a festive procession back to the palace, such as no king has ever seen equalled.